All right, so without any further ado, I'll introduce myself, who will be giving the program, Harry Davenport, Canton's famous actor. As I mentioned, Harry Davenport's father was E.L. Davenport, and E.L. Davenport came to Minnequaw Springs, north of Canton, in 1872 to the Minnequaw House that had been started there, and the detailed information on the Minnequaw Springs is in the Settler magazine, so I won't elaborate on that. But he brought with him his wife, Fanny Lily Vining Davenport. Both of them were actors, and they bought a summer home on Upper Troy Street in Canton because they liked the name or the place so much, and decided that they would come here in their times of rest in Bradford County to recuperate from their time on the road. And Fanny had, and Edward had 9 children. The oldest, also named Fanny, who had a summer home in Canton as well. And the others were Blanche, Lily, May, Florence, Edward, who died young, and Adele, who died young. Edgar and Harry was the youngest. And all of them were on stage at one point or another. So Harry was born Harry George Bryant Davenport on January 19th, 1866 in New York City. And he could trace his ancestry back through 10 generations to 1680. All of those family members had been on stage all the way back to England. And when he became famous, he dropped his middle names, and so it just became Harry Davenport. He said one time, "It was the most natural thing in the world that I should begin to act as soon as I was old enough. Once I started, it was just as natural that I should keep it up." So his debut was at the Chestnut Street Theater in Philadelphia, which is shown on the right side of this picture. And it was in the play called Damon and Pythias, which was a popular play in those days, taken out of Greek mythology and talked about trust and loyalty in a friendship. And Harry played the son of Damon, and the Chestnut Street Theater was operated by his father at that time in 1871. And this is about the time that they came to Minnequaw Springs, just prior to that. And he had played that part often, and as a child, and he was only about 5 years old at that time. So his first line on the stage was, "I want to be a soldier like Pythias." And one author has written, as they listened to the little boy in the velvet suit and long glinting curls, his father E.L. Davenport and his mother Fanny knew that in his heart he meant, "I want to be an actor." In 1940, he was interviewed, and he said what he really meant was, "I want to be an actor like my daddy." He was often included in the cast with his father, and so learned quite a bit about acting from his own father, and a lot about work. Every member of the Davenport family seemed to be a workaholic, if you want to use that term. They, especially Harry's father and his sister Fanny, who eventually died from working too hard. So he received his first salary from this play at the age of 5, and it was all in United States coins, one of each denomination from 1 cent to $1, amounting to $1.95. They were all minted in 1871, and later a $5 gold piece was later added as a bonus. He kept them in a safe deposit box the rest of his life and often said that $1 million couldn't purchase them. He said in 1921 that whenever an actor came along with a play that required children, it was my time to appear. That was in the New York Herald. So all through his childhood years, he was in one play after another and learned the stage very, very young. Living next door to the summer home of the Davenports was Crockett Lodge, which was owned by Frank Mayo. Frank was a good friend of Harry's father. All of them were actors. The Mayo family were actors too, and actresses. And Frank Mayo had been a pallbearer at Harry's father's funeral, and so they were very close. And Harry learned quite a lot from Frank Mayo in his early years. Harry's own father had died around 1875-76, and so Harry really learned a lot about acting in his later years from Frank Mayo. He was in one of Frank Mayo's most well-known plays, which was Davy Crockett. And Davy Crockett had been a play that was done by another man, actually, and the reviews by the newspapers were so negative that the guy who actually wrote the play ended up dying in his 20s because he was heartbroken, is what the newspapers said, that his play had been rejected. But Frank Mayo really took over after that, and he made the role famous. And Harry was, as a young child, in that play. When Harry was coming into his teenage years, there was an operetta that swept across America called HMS Pinafore, and it was a love story between a naval captain's daughter and a sailor. And in 1879, John Ford organized a company of children to play this production, and Harry, at the age of 13, was the lead role of Sir Joseph Porter. And this was his first singing part on stage, first of many over the years. HMS Pinafore was the end of his childhood roles. He felt at that time he was just too old to play children's roles anymore. And so the family sent him off to school, after which he came back on the road again in several of Frank Mayo's plays. And at that time, a newspaper said later on that Mr. Davenport claimed he was the first actor to see Hollywood. While trouping with a theatrical company in 1885, he rode out of Los Angeles in a buggy to watch people picking holly for Christmas decorations. That wilderness later became the movie capital. In 1888, he was in the play La Tosca with his sister Fanny. This is Fanny, his oldest sister, who had a house in Canton as well. Fanny is a whole nother presentation, which I tried to fit into this one, but there's just too much to say. So this was Harry's last drama that he was in, and after this, he got into comedies rather than dramas, which he would remain in then the rest of his career on Broadway. The next major play that he was in that really made a difference in his life was Pudd'nhead Wilson. And Frank Mayo and Mark Twain were very good friends. Frank Mayo had met Mark Twain had years previous to that, and actually had taken character attributes of his friend Mark Twain and put it into the role of Davy Crockett. And Frank Mayo had said at one time that Mark Twain was always at every performance of Davy Crockett that he'd ever given, and so he would have watched Harry on the stage as well as a young boy. He asked Mark Twain on the street one day if he could make a play out of his story Pudd'nhead Wilson, which had already been popular. And Mark Twain said, well, sure, go ahead, write it, I don't care, that's fine, you can have the rights, we'll meet later and talk about it. I know it'll be good, you just go ahead and do it. So he wrote that play, and Harry Davenport later remembered, there's Mark Twain, Harry Davenport later remembered some experiences he had with Frank Mayo at that time. He said, during the rehearsals previous to the first production of Pudd'nhead Wilson, Mr. Mayo acted every role in the play for the purpose of showing the members of his company how he wanted them played. He took infinite pains to see that every line was properly read, every accent properly placed, and every bit of business brought out clearly, effectively, and naturally. I would not have it understood that in this matter Mr. Mayo was a martinet or one who assumed to know it all. No one admired originality more than he. He liked to see an actor give his own conception of a part, but when this was done, he demanded a reason for everything. This was one of his peculiar traits. If a member of the company made a gesture or a pause or emphasized a word in a new or original manner, Mr. Mayo would say, "Now, why do you do that?" He would get at the bottom of the idea, and if a good reason was advanced for it, he found ready acceptance. He was this way in everything. I remember that he taught me fencing when I was a mere boy, and in return I taught him what I knew about boxing. I usually boxed about 1 minute and explained 15. I would make a lead or a counter or a guard, and Mr. Mayo would say, "Stop. Now, why do you do that?" And when he was teaching me fencing, he would make a thrust or parry and then stop to say, "Now, you see, I do this because..." Pudd'N Wilson premiered at the Herald Square Theater in New York City on Monday, April 15th, 1895, and Mayo played the role of Pudd'N Wilson. And the reviews in the newspapers were very favorable about this play, and it said that Harry Davenport had played the role of York Driscoll, which was the county judge. And the New York Times said he was a careful study of character, and later said that the acting of Harry Davenport was uncommonly vivid and effective. So about this time in his life, he was in a comedy company, and another young girl was in that company named Alice Shepard. And in February of 1892, they had played in a play at that time, and apparently fell in love and were married January 25th, 1893. And she was later an actress in many of Charlie Chaplin's early films. They had a daughter, Dorothy, and after a few years of marriage, the marriage obviously didn't work out, and Harry attempted to divorce Alice, but she wouldn't have any part of divorce. She wouldn't give him a divorce, and so they separated instead, but Harry, always being the one to pay all of his debts, decided that he was going to support Dorothy without, any major court battles or anything. And so it was about this time, though, that Dorothy and Harry became estranged, and then for the rest of Harry's life, there was never any communication between the two. And she lived with her mother after that. But this was one thing that Harry regretted all of his life, was what had happened with his first wife, and especially with his daughter, and the fact that this estrangement had taken place. And he didn't discuss that with anyone, not even with close Canton friends, but his second wife, Phyllis, knew about it, and really it didn't come out until he died and his will was opened, which I'll mention at the end of the program. Jumping ahead, Alice finally granted him a divorce, and I'll mention a little bit more about this in a minute. But after that, no one knew where Alice and Dorothy went off to until Dorothy turned up as an actress in 1910. By the time Dorothy was 17, she was a star at Universal Studios. She was a horsewoman of distinction and did many of her own stunts in films. Dorothy is shown in this picture here, and what's good about this picture is that on the right side is a picture of Alice, which is the only picture of Harry's first wife I've ever found. Unfortunately, she's not turned around, so we can't see her face, but that is Alice and Dorothy acting in a film together. While at Universal Studios, she met an actor named Wallace Reed, and they were married in 1913, had 2 children. And while filming on location for a movie in 1919, Wallace Reed was injured in a train wreck. And as a result, the studio doctors administered large doses of morphine to Reed, of which he later became addicted, and it later killed him. His health grew worse over the next few years after that, and he died from the addiction in 1923. And Dorothy later went on then, shortly after that, to make a movie called Human Wreckage, which dealt with the dangers of narcotics addiction in Hollywood. And so she was quite an advocate, really, for drug prevention, really, after what had happened to her husband. Probably the biggest play in Harry Davenport's life was that of the Belle of New York, and this would change his life forever. Harry, even as a young child, knew a girl by the name of Phyllis Rankin. She was a musical comedy star, and both of them acted in the play The Belle of New York. September 28th, 1897, The Belle of New York opened at the Casino Theater on Broadway, and it only had 56 performances, which was barely enough for survival in those days. And so they went on the road trying to recoup some losses from this. It ended up with encouraging results at that point, and so they decided to go overseas and went to London, where they opened in 1898, eventually giving 674 performances, which was the longest run in London for an American musical up to that time. In The Belle of New York, Harry played Harry Bronson, and Phyllis played Fifi Fricot, and Phyllis was a standout in the chorus line, and she was described in her part as a little Parisian. The New York Times said, Harry Davenport lends a pleasing personality and good dramatic skill to the role of the prodigal and manages his songs very well. Now, the two sang a duet together called When We Are Married, and obviously after 674 performances in London alone, they decided to fall in love with each other. And later in life, he was interviewed, and he said, we had known each other since childhood, but it was when we sang together When We Were Married that the idea of falling in love came to us. We sang the song for a season and then decided to make it real. Interestingly enough, though, he was still married to Alice, which that presents a little problem. And she had no intention of divorcing him. So Phyllis decided to visit Alice one day and offered to pay her to divorce Harry. And Alice agreed. She accepted the money and promptly divorced Harry. Phyllis said in later years, it was a real love affair. I was much better fixed financially than he was at the time, so it was the only logical thing to do. Harry and Phyllis were married in London on May 2nd, 1901. Phyllis had 2 children by her previous marriage, and then they later had 2 children together. But Phyllis was the daughter of A.M. Rankin, who had built in New York the first electrically lighted theater in the world. Phyllis had an older sister, Gladys, who had married Sidney Drew. The Drews were another of the major theatrical families, and also in Hollywood. And her younger sister, Doris, married Lionel Barrymore. And so then, after all of this, you have a connection between the Davenports, the Drews, and the Barrymores and the Rankins, which ended up creating the largest family of actors in Hollywood. Lionel Barrymore, as a young actor, had visited Harry Davenport in Canton, and there he met Doris Rankin, and they were married June 19th, 1904. She later divorced him in 1922, however, because he was found in the company of another actress. Need I say any more? But Lionel Barrymore might be best remembered as Mr. Potter in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Phyllis retained her surname professionally throughout her life, but to the townspeople in Canton, she would be known as Mrs. Davenport. Her son, Arthur Rankin, retained his name, Rankin, whereas Kate took the name Davenport. But Arthur was a popular actor, although he never did visit Canton. He served in the Marine Corps in World War I, where he was then discharged, but he was wounded in battle at that time. But after he was discharged, he then went into the British Army. But Phyllis, besides Kate and Arthur, had children, Fanny and Edward also known as Ned. And at this point in time, Harry got into the silent films. And this was a major transition in his life because he'd been on stage all of his life, and so this was a new technology. He decided to make this transition and was one of the early ones to do this. In 1902, the New York Times said, "This actor is one of the few real masters of the art of makeup on the American stage. He has made more of a specialty of what may be called old men makeups, and he does not go in for the grotesque effects." In 1907, Harry and Phyllis made their first appearance in vaudeville, and in 1912 was his first appearance on screen. Now, he had directed a company of actors of his own in Philadelphia, so he had some kind of directing experience, at least on the stage. But one movie he was in, a silent picture, the director became ill the day that the picture was supposed to start. So the producer handed Davenport, as the man with the most experience in the group, the assignment of directing the movie. And so Davenport later recalled that he did a fairly credible piece of work with that movie. He was a director with Vitagraph Studios, which was the oldest motion picture company in America, and the company was located in Brooklyn, and Vitagraph was slowly squeezed out of the business and was later bought by Warner Brothers in 1925. In 1915, Davenport made 14 two-reel movies for the Vitagraph Company about the Jar family, and each film was about 20 minutes in length, contained a storyline, dramatic situations, and acting talent. The first movie was called The Jar Family Discovers Harlem. Harry would act in each of these movies as well. And then came the movie A Son of the Hills, which he was commissioned to direct by Vitagraph Company. And just about this time, he returned to Canton, where Davenport Villa, the family home, was waiting. And after his parents had died, Harry's older sister Blanche had moved in and lived in the house for several years. And after she left, Harry's brother Edgar lived there one summer, and then Harry purchased the house for himself. And by this time, it needed quite a bit of work done on it. The Canton Sentinel said in June 22nd, 1916, that Harry Davenport and family are now occupying Crockett Lodge, while their own cottage, Davenport Villa, is undergoing the necessary repairs to make it comfortable for them. He expects to call it home, and while he cannot remain here all the time, he will spend his vacations here and an occasional weekend during the year. And then he says he wants to end his days in the beautiful spot so loved by his father, the late E.L. Davenport. So A Son of the Hills had been a book, was published in 1913, written by Harriet T. Comstock. And in 1916, Harry brought a team of filmmakers from Vitagraph Studios in New York to Canton in order to direct his first feature film. The Canton Sentinel said in 1916, commissioned to direct the production of this new picture drama, there was no place in the world that appealed to him as strongly as the hills where he spent his happiest and most carefree days. Accordingly, it was to Canton he brought his troupe of movie actors. And A Son of the Hills was basically a love story between the character Sandy Morley and the character Cynthia Starr. And after going through all sorts of trials and tribulations, the two were eventually married and lived happily ever after. Most of the interior scenes for the movie were shot there at the Vitagraph Studios in Brooklyn, but A Son of the Hills was mostly an outdoor movie. And so most of the outdoor shots were shot in and around Canton. Several places in and around Canton were used in the movie, and the picture opened with this view, or one similar, of Canton looking to the north. Davenport Villa was used in the movie. An abandoned creamery at Cedar Ledge was used. Caledonia Lodge on Southern Avenue, which was the residence of Daniel Innes, was used in the movie. The Canton High School building, which was new that year, was used as the college where Sandy graduated with honors. The Pennsylvania Railroad station on Troy Street was used. The water wheel at Rockwell's Mill. The main square of Canton. And shots at Lake Nafon, which was very important to the movie because a climatic scene in the movie entailed the burning of an abandoned house that they found there. And it seemed to work out pretty well because they needed to burn a house and be able to rescue a person from the house in this scene. And so after filming this, the next part of the scene was that a local businessman from Canton who was filling the role drove a car from Lake Nafon to the hospital, which was the Green Free Library. And the library made a pretty good spot for a hospital. It was pretty convincing in the film. The actor stayed at the Hotel Packard, which building is still there on Main Street. This is a picture of Harry standing in front of the hotel in his directing outfit, and that was shown in the papers at that time. The cast, or at least part of them, is shown in this picture, standing on the front steps of the Packard Hotel. And on the left is Antonio Moreno, who was the leading man in the picture. Next to him, to the right, is Phyllis Davenport, Harry's wife. Next to Phyllis is Belle Bruce, who is the leading lady in the picture. And up there behind Phyllis is Harry, not paying attention, looking off to his right, in the bow tie there. And clear up in the back is Edward Innes of Canton in the straw hat. Now, the cast, as I mentioned, included Antonio Moreno, who played Sandy Morley, and Belle Bruce, who was Cynthia Starr. But another name that might be recognizable is at the very bottom. Harry's daughter, Kate Davenport, played a role in the movie as well. Now, Antonio Moreno was not yet well known at that time. He had been born in Madrid, had a Spanish accent, and usually portrayed Latin lovers in the movies. Antonio Moreno mingled easily with the Canton townspeople, especially at the Hotel Packard bar. Moreno did have his fans among the opposite sex, however, and two sisters remembered when they were 7 and 13 how they found excuses to visit their grandmother every day while shooting was underway at Davenport Villa next door to steal looks at the movie stars. Once on the way, they were stopped by no less a personage than Moreno himself, who asked them oh so politely, they recalled, to wait a few moments until the scene was completed. The elder of the two seized the golden opportunity by greeting him by name. He smiled and patted her hand. According to her sister, I'm sure she didn't wash it for a week. The movie also starred Belle Bruce, and Harry had worked with Belle Bruce in 3 of the Jar family movies the previous year. And Belle Bruce also created a sensation among the town's young male population. She had, as one person wrote, worldly experience, fashionable high-style clothes, bearing, and an aura of glamour. And one person said, Miss Bruce was ogled wherever she appeared in public, partly as a curiosity, but mainly because the young boys thought she was a knockout. The home of John Lamont on Lycoming Street was used as a dressing room by the actors, and Mr. Lamont and his family had to be out of the house every morning at 9 o'clock and could not return until evening. Now, the Canton Sentinel had plenty to say about the ongoing events at that time. And speaking of Harry Davenport, it said, he also announces that spectators are welcome during the work of the company, and those who desire to see real moving pictures have only to inquire of some of the company as to the locality in which they are working. Also, he will need a great many people, little and big, in some of the scenes, and those who care to have the experience of performing are requested to give their names and addresses to Mr. Davenport himself or to Mr. John Braun at the Packard House. They will then receive notice when the management is ready for their services. Another feature of this company being in town was that they decided it would be a good time to show other movies in which these actors appearing in this movie had appeared in previously at the local theater so that people could see them on the screen and then be able to talk to them on the street. And the paper also, the Canton Sentinel, reported, if these pictures are a success, others will be made here in the future, and there's a possibility of a movie studio in this vicinity. I'm not sure whatever happened to that. The townspeople were also pleased when the camera crew and others of the Videograph entourage joined in such local activities as weekend baseball and bending elbows at the local hotel bar. Now, these were the early days of spectacular Hollywood premieres where stars attended in all their finery, and The Son of the Hills premiered right in Canton at the Crawford Theater, which is better known today as the Rialto Theater. And Davenport brought Antonio Moreno and Belle Bruce back to Canton for the premiere. After the movie, Miss Bruce made her appearance, beautifully gowned, and young girls from Canton who had been in the film each presented her with a bouquet of flowers, which she eventually had quite an armload of. And one girl in the front row remembered she was very gracious and told the audience how much she had enjoyed our lovely town and our hospitality. Right after this movie was done, a second movie was the background scenes were filmed in Canton called A Heart of a Fool, and the actors then went back to Brooklyn and filmed the interior scenes for that movie, which was subsequently released in 1916. In that movie, Harry played one of the roles, and also Belle Bruce was in that movie. Harry Davenport was quoted later in life. He said, he talked about the roles in which he preferred to take in movies and plays, and said that he had ideas and ideals of the parts that he preferred to take. He said, "Don't misunderstand me, I'm no prude, but in those 69 years as an actor, I've never taken and never intend to take a part in a play or picture that has a salacious line. I have been offered parts in such plays, and I have made enemies by refusing to do them. The playwrights can go on writing them, but I've always considered it my prerogative to refuse to act in them. Off-color lines and stories belong only in the intimacy of your club, but they are certainly out of place in the theater." In 1922, on New Year's Day, he appeared at a Brooklyn church where he was to speak on this topic of clean plays. And the New York Times reported, after hearing Harry Davenport, the actor now appearing in the play Thank You, speak on clean plays from the pulpit of the Harrison Place Methodist Episcopal Church, Brooklyn, last evening, the Reverend Harry Dwight Miller, the pastor, declared that the so-called ban of the church upon the theater had misrepresented Methodism and had driven thousands of young people from its fold. Harry said during his talk that day, "The majority of actors and actresses are a decent sort of persons. They prefer clean roles. Many of them do not like the roles the managers make them portray, but they have to earn a living and have to depict the characters the playwrights write for them. If the public demands clean plays, it will get them." Mr. Davenport defined a clean play as one to which a man could take his wife, sister, or daughter and not have them blush. After the service, Mr. Davenport said that the possibility of starting a campaign for a public demand for clean plays had appealed to him for several months. He had at first made only occasional talks on the subject, he said, but had recently been in the habit of advocating such a movement nightly in a curtailed speech between the acts at the Long Acre Theater. In the 1920s and 30s, it was hard times for the Davenport family, and so they returned to Canton and decided to live full-time in their summer home. This gave the Canton community an opportunity to get to know them. This newspaper article appeared in 1932 in a Philadelphia newspaper and shows the house at that time. The house had 14 rooms. This is a picture taken in 1997 of the house, which is still there. A couple of the rooms that I'll mention in there were a parlor and a library, which were in the front of the house. And here in the library, he had 2,000 books, originally the property of his father, but had been added to by himself. A newspaper account said that the home contains many treasures of the Davenport family. And you have to remember that his father and his mother had lived there, and his sister had lived there, and all of their belongings had stayed in the house, and so there's quite a history had been left in the house even before he got there. And it said, here too are a number of antiques, including furniture, once, it is said, used by the family of Abraham Lincoln. On the third floor of the home was a glass-enclosed cupola, where there were lots of magazines and posters of Shakespearean plays and other memorabilia left over from parts played by family members. Family life at Davenport Villa was a model to be envied. It was a typical household full of respect and love, no harsh words, never a voice raised in anger, and they enjoyed doing scenes from plays rather than playing cards. Harry was a downtown regular in Canton. He chatted casually with people on the sidewalk. His wife, Phyllis, swept into a room. She was a presence in bearing and in voice. She was partial to wide-brimmed hats, which she felt accentuated her height. Daughter Kate participated in several community plays and often was the one who drove the car for the family. Daughter Fanny wore exotic costumes, and engaging her in conversation was to participate in a performance. Fanny was the reincarnation of her Aunt Fanny, and acted like her, talked like her, and looked like her. She looked past Canton people oftentimes into the clouds, much like her Aunt Fanny had done. And son Ned, Harry and Ned often fenced instead of playing catch when Ned was a young boy. Ned was in Boy Scouts in Canton and even attained the rank of Eagle Scout in Canton. He was part of the class of 1932 at Canton High School. Harry was often invited to speak before various groups in the Canton community, and often he would give a talk at Canton High School to the students during the regular assembly period, and students would learn the advantages of speaking good English, of enunciating clearly, and Harry often would share his stage experiences with the students. In 1925 and 26, in that school year, the play Daddy Longlegs was performed at the Canton High School, and Davenport offered to help Irene Hurley direct the play. He tried to give advice to two students on how they should perform a kissing scene, much to the chagrin of the students who were playing the scene. Harry didn't know how to drive, which is why I mentioned Kate often drove the car. He was offered rides often into Canton from Davenport Villa. His neighbor drove a Model T Ford, and one time Harry asked his neighbor to teach him how to drive. The neighbor would return from these sessions a nervous wreck. He would say, Davenport was a genius at making a Model T leap and bound. Phyllis, in the early summer of 1917, cooked and canned in glass 1,000 quarts of vegetable soup in her own kitchen, with ingredients almost entirely from her own garden. She recruited the Canton Boy Scouts to come and dig, pick, and clean the vegetables. She did all the cooking and canning herself. She would work 24 hours at a stretch to complete a run of 140 quarts, which was the capacity of her kitchen equipment. This work inspired Louis Marble of the Belmar factory in Canton to equip a Red Cross soup kitchen at the Belmar as a donation to the Red Cross work during World War I. Phyllis was placed in charge of this, and several Red Cross auxiliaries in the area were enlisted to help. On January 1918, a carload shipped from Canton on the Pennsylvania Railroad with 9,359 quarts, or 36,000 pounds of vegetable soup. It was loaded aboard a ship headed for France to be delivered to hospitals near the front, and the remainder was sent to military hospitals in the United States. And you have to remember that her son Arthur Rankin was in World War I at the time, so she had pretty good reason for this volunteer work. During the growing season, Mrs. Davenport would buy wild strawberries, raspberries, and currants, and other fruit, in which she would can and make into jars to sell. And many students and even adults would bring their pails of berries to her in exchange for a small amount of money. Prizes would be given for the most berries picked, and one time a bicycle was given as a prize to the children. Mrs. Davenport made many a kettle of jam that was put into small glass jars and was packed into cartons and sent to a Philadelphia hotel or to New York and were served in the dining rooms of the major hotels. She once said, "I'd rather be a good actress than anything I know, but it must be swell to be a good farmer, too. However, strawberry preserves are as near to farming as I can get." She opened the parlor in the library in Davenport Villa to have a tea room about that time, and it was so successful that the Davenport family purchased a brick house at Leolin, south of Canton, and decided to open a tea room there in that building. That house was built in 1826, and the property was purchased by Mr. and Mrs. Davenport and was beautifully restored by them. It was furnished throughout with rare antiques and opened as a tea room under the name of the Boar's Head Inn, later called the Tavern. And there, Sunday chicken dinners were served, and on weeknights, by reservation, small groups could have a quiet dinner. On Sundays, many people would drive out from Williamsport and Elmira for a nice drive and a delicious dinner. Fanny was the hostess, Kate provided the meal, and Mr. and Mrs. Davenport prepared the desserts. They also hired a waitress and a handyman to work for them there. The Davenports owned a Model T touring car, and Kate would drive back and forth between the tavern and Davenport Villa, keeping things going on both ends. So many people admired the linen that Mrs. Davenport had made for the tables in the tavern that she began selling the linen tablecloths to patrons one by one. And she found that the linen became more of a moneymaker than the tavern itself, and so she decided they needed to close the tea room and go in full-time to making linen. And that's what they did. After Harry went to Hollywood, this is jumping ahead, and Phyllis had died, the house was still owned by the Davenport family. It became the target of slingshots for young children, and the wind and weather took a further toll until little had remained of the Davenport restoration. The property was sold in 1951. So this picture of the house shows the windows busted out, mostly from that time period. Phyllis had begun weaving and spinning linen on one of her theatrical tours. She and Harry were playing in Chicago at one time, and the days were so long that she became bored and had nothing to do. She saw a loom while there, and she decided to learn the art. Frequently, as she went on tours for various productions, she took along a small loom as part of her baggage so that she could do this weaving as she had nothing to do. Phyllis also had an entire room in Davenport Villa devoted to weaving equipment and included several looms. She'd spin the flax herself. She could weave everything from a band for a wristwatch to placemats, table runners, napkins, towels, and even a room-sized rug. She often gave demonstrations, and this picture shows her at Davenport Villa. The Davenports also performed about a half dozen or so or more plays while they were in Canton from the period 1925 to 34, which is the time period in Harry's career that was very lean for him. There wasn't much demand for him on stage, and so they sought to make money in all these various ways, including staging plays. Sometimes the plays would benefit local community groups, but many times they would simply benefit the Davenport family, so they could simply pay their bills. Usually, the cast of these plays was made up of Canton residents who acted alongside the Davenport family. And the first play they did was Thank You, which I had mentioned previously because it had already been on Broadway previously. So Harry was pretty familiar with this play. thank you was presented in March of 1925, was a benefit to the Davenport family. And the reason I mention that it's a benefit to the Davenport family is because they had many bills that had mounted, since he didn't have an active career at this time in his life. The refurbishing of Davenport Villa was quite expensive. Phyllis had retired from the stage, so she was no longer bringing in an income. And Harry's only role in 1924 was in a play that was a disaster because it was so unpopular. So Thank You was a huge success in Canton. It was performed in the Canton High School auditorium and sold out for several performances. Mr. Davenport in the Canton Sentinel was quoted. It said, "Mr. Davenport in his original part was so real that for the time being we thought of him as a kind-hearted, spiritual-minded country rector, and it almost seemed as if before going to press he should come into the office with some church notices." The 1925-26 season looked a little bit better for him in New York, but in 1929 they turned back to Canton for more home talent in order to make money that way. Another play they did is The Private Secretary. This is the program from that, which features several Canton residents at that time. One of the last plays they did was called Helena's Boys, which was performed in Canton High School auditorium and then brought to Towanda High School auditorium and performed May 31st, 1933. And after that, a reception was held at the Lake Wasauking Lodge for people to come and be able to meet the Davenports. Phyllis told a reporter in 1932, "I'd rather be a good actress than anything I know. Every now and then I take myself out of mothballs and go back for a time." The play The Cradle Song was the last professional show that she appeared in, and the last time she appeared on stage altogether was in the play Helena's Boys at Towanda High School in 1933. She suffered a stroke the following winter, and her health later declined steadily after that until she died on November 17, 1934, at the age of 59. This picture was taken only 2 months after Phyllis died, and Harry looks a little bit sad. He was quite heartbroken when Phyllis died. This picture was taken January 1935, and shortly after that, he was interviewed, and he said, "Most of my treasures of past theater days are at my home in Canton, PA. Mrs. Davenport passed away in that house. I haven't stepped inside its door since it happened. I want to let those memories stay closed up there for a while, for they are very dear." So Harry is now 70 years old, and he needs something to do with his life. Phyllis was now gone. And January 18th, 1935, he was interviewed in the New York Times. And this was the day before he was to perform in a play called Battleship Gertie. And he said that he confessed that he had lost none of his congenial enthusiasm for the stage. But as for stage roles, he said, "I liked them all, the big ones and the little ones. I guess what it amounts to is just that I like the theater and always will." And his son Ned, who was with him at the time, said, "All of us do." Harry predicted a bright future for the theater at that time, and he did see a few problems, though. He did point out that the movies have not hurt the theater a bit. This new technology of movies was being said to take away from the theater. He said the worst thing is the radio, for on rainy nights, people will stay home by the fireside and take their entertainment with dry feet. Battleship Gertie then was performed the very next day and was performed 2 times, and it was an absolute disaster. And that was his very last appearance on Broadway, just a day after he had spoke about the future of the theater, which is kind of interesting. So he went back to Canton, where Fanny and Kate were there living, and he was surrounded by the memories of the accumulations of his family. The curtain had come down on his life, on his theatrical career. The lights had gone out, and he was broke. So at this time in his life, he really didn't know what he was going to do. He left Canton in 1932, which was to be the last time he would see Canton, 1935, I should say, last time he would see Canton, and decided he would drive west, which many people didn't think he would make it because he wasn't a good driver. And Ned, his son, was with him. He was headed to California to visit with his children, and on the way stopped in Chicago and ended up back on the stage for another 63 weeks in the play Three Men and a Horse. And after that, he went on to Hollywood to spend a few weeks with his children. Harry resided with his son, who lived in a bungalow there in Hollywood, and it was on the corner of Las Palmas and Franklin Streets, and he could hear the sounds of Hollywood Boulevard, which is just a few blocks away. Harry had not gone to Hollywood previous to this because Phyllis did not want any part of Hollywood. She felt, because he was so popular, that if they got to Hollywood, he would be gone on the stage for all the time, and yet she was not getting any offers to be on the stage, so she kind of thought she would be alone. And so once he got to Hollywood, the film producers learned he was in town, and only 2 days went by before a film producer learned he was in Hollywood and called him up and put him to work. Harry's supposed to be on vacation visiting his children. And from that time until his death, he worked steadily from one film to the next. He didn't buy a house in California until every creditor in Canton had been paid off, because he still had several bills built up. And so, one of his early movies was Paradise Express in 1937. A movie that he made, he was in the lead role, was Young Fugitives in 1938. It was about this time that a newspaper article appeared talking about Harry Davenport, and it said, "I never see that fine old actor Harry Davenport making the most of a screen role without reflecting that it's never too late in Hollywood. A few years ago, Davenport was acting and directing for the Federal Theater Project for $90 a month. He had turned 70 and his savings had been wiped out, and neither stage nor screen producers were interested in his bid for employment. The wild optimist in show business wouldn't have given a plug nickel for his professional future. Look at him now, one of the most sought-after actors in Hollywood, drawing a fat paycheck, mentioned for Academy Awards, cited whenever critics talk about fine actors. One turn of the Hollywood wheel of fortune and he found himself atop the heap. Nothing can shake the kind of success that he has achieved so belatedly." And then came the movie that he was probably most known in, and that is Gone with the Wind. The year was 1939, and 10,000 people were considered for roles in the movie Gone with the Wind. Thousands underwent screen tests, and 4,400 were eventually employed in the making of that movie. When it came to fill the role of Dr. Meade, which was called for a kind-hearted, dignified doctor, director David O. Selznick wanted Lyle Barrymore to play that role. But Barrymore was immediately ruled out because he was in a wheelchair. He had several health problems, and so the next choice that Selznick had was Harry Davenport. The Daily Review, 1939, announced, it said that Harry Davenport of Canton has been cast for a role in Gone with the Wind was revealed here yesterday by W.L. Wooden, manager of the Keystone Theater. Mr. Wooden is advertising literature on the picture and noticed Mr. Davenport's name in the character list. He was one of 11 principals in the cast after only 3 years in Hollywood, which was quite an accomplishment. He was 74 years old at the time of filming Gone with the Wind and was the oldest actor in the movie. Filming started December 11th, 1938. The budget for the film was $2.5 million, which was unheard of in those days, but it eventually cost them $4.25 million to produce Gone with the Wind. When adjusted for inflation, Gone with the Wind has grossed more money than any movie in history. This film gave Harry more opportunities for employment throughout Hollywood in more credible movies than he would have otherwise. After the filming of Gone with the Wind, they had a cast party, and Harry was honored for his 69th year on stage. This picture was taken at that time, and shows in the picture Harry being honored with a director's chair with his name on it. And in the photo from the left is his son, Ned Davenport, and next to him is Victor Fleming. And then next in line is Olivia de Havilland, who played Melanie Wilkes. On the other side of Harry, Vivian Lee, who played Scarlett O'Hara, Leslie Howard, who played Ashley Wilkes, and Clark Gable, who played Rhett Butler. Canton friends were pleased, and shortly after Gone with the Wind came out, this article came out and gave a short overview of Harry Davenport's life up to that point. In a 1940 interview, he said, "I think I'll stay with the screen. After all, I've done my share of wandering. I've been in every city of size in the United States and Canada and left my fingerprints in more dressing rooms than you could count. I enjoyed every single day of it, however, and I suppose if a good stage part came along, I might pack up my trunks again and move. One of the earlier Davenports must have been kicked by a fire horse, I imagine. Sound a call bell, and we're on our way." Harry had countless connections among producers and directors. He was in demand everywhere, from Warner Brothers to 20th Century Fox, RKO, and even Alfred Hitchcock. It was difficult for him, given his age, to do these movies. He was in excellent health, but the hours were long, and the boredom of going through the same scene 20 or 30 times was simply exhausting for him. He often played a grandfather, a judge, or a minister in most of the movies he was in. His hair was so completely white that it had to be tinted for his movie work. Otherwise, it looked metallic and artificial. He liked to joke that only artificial color could make it look real. The next important movie he was in the same year as Gone with the Wind was The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1939. Granny, Get Your Gun in 1940 with May Robson, who was also a success late in life, just like Harry. All This in Heaven 2 in 1940 with Bette Davis. Lucky Partners in 1940, there he's playing a judge. Foreign Correspondent, which was an Alfred Hitchcock film in 1940, and Harry played the role of Mr. Powers. And That Uncertain Feeling in 1941. That same year, on his current job, it was reported Davenport was making $1,250 a week, and he said, "I'm getting my money saved up for my old age." At that time, Harry was living with his son and his 2 daughters, and he indulged in the hobby of cutting and polishing fine stones. On a Sunday, he'd go out into the hills and come back with 150 pounds of stones in his car. After his death, the Los Angeles Times ran an interview in 1954 with Harry's doctor, who reminisced about visiting Harry for a routine health checkup and finding him surrounded by a collection of semi-precious stones that he had polished himself. The doctor later became interested in these stones, and they included moonstone, jasper, agate, and jadeite. To show, however, that Harry didn't forget his Canton roots, this is a letter that he sent to Mrs. Lean Kegel in Canton in 1943. She had sent him a letter asking him to identify some Minnequaw Springs photos, and he wrote right back to her despite his busy schedule and told him what he knew. And at the end, he says, "With kindest regards to you and Mr. Kegel and all of our other friends, from all of us, I remain sincerely yours, Harry Davenport." Same year, he was in the Oxbow incident. where he made an impassioned attempt to stop a lynching. And to show how versatile he was, this is him in the movie Kismet in 1944. His son Ned had enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1942, and Arthur went back into the war in 1942 as well, in World War II, and served in the Marine Corps. And so Harry and daughter Kate did some volunteer work. They worked at the Hollywood Canteen, which was a place where famous actors would often go to volunteer their time for servicemen who are usually on their way going overseas. And so Harry served as a busboy, and Kate worked in the kitchen. This was something that was spearheaded by Bette Davis. And then came probably what was the second most popular movie he was in, and that was Meet Me in St. Louis. This was in 1944, during World War II, and at that time Hollywood felt that its role in the war was to distract wives and families from the ongoing war effort with movies that provided lavish scenes and costumes, thereby giving them some temporary relief. Meet Me in St. Louis was described as 113 minutes of unalloyed delight, delectable entertainment, graceful, heartwarming, endearing, the best musical ever. The Smiths and their home in Technicolor are eyefuls of scenic delight, and the bursting vitality of their living inspires you like vitamin A. In this movie, the song Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas was first sung. And now he was the oldest actor in Hollywood. And in 1945, he appeared in The Enchanted Forest. The local papers advertised him as the actor starring at 74 years old. He was in a Lassie movie about this time, and this picture is taken of a birthday party for Harry Davenport in January 1946, and the caption said, "Harry Davenport, the oldest living American actor, celebrated his 80th birthday yesterday and was greeted by 8-year-old Butch Jenkins, the youngest actor. Davenport, who has been in motion pictures since 1912, is currently one of the most in-demand actors in the profession. On his birthday, he was working simultaneously in his 99th and 100th film roles in MGM's Three Wise Fools and Faithful in My Fashion." Harry's birthdays were usually celebrated on the set during subsequent films, especially when Bette Davis happened to be in those films. Bette Davis never held too many people in high regard, but she did like Harry Davenport a great deal. One of his most prized possessions was a special telegram which his son Arthur Rankin had sent to him on the anniversary of his 60th anniversary on stage. The message was mounted on a 10-foot-long scroll and bared the signatures of 387 Hollywood notables. Was dated April 23, 1931, and Davenport had been urged to exhibit it at the New York World's Fair. Some of his last movies that he was in was Sport of Kings in 1947, where he played with Gloria Henry. And to show how busy he was, the same year he appeared with Gloria Henry again in the movie Keeper of Bees. Another well-known movie was the same year, 1947, he appeared in The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer with Cary Grant. That Forsyte Woman in 1949. Tell It to the Judge the same year. And this graph shows Harry and how busy Harry was over the years that he was in Hollywood, each bar showing how many films he was in each year that he was there. And you know, it's 1937, he was in 19 films in 1 year. He was a pretty busy guy in his 70s. He was in well over 100 films during his career, and he was one of only 16 actors who have appeared in 3 or more Best Picture Oscar winners. In the summer of 1949, Harry finished filming for the movie Riding High. On August 9th, 1949, he called Walter Herzbrun, his agent for 15 years, to inquire about a role that he had been assigned to on a picture that was to start the next week. Only an hour after he had spoken to him, he died of a heart attack at the age of 83 years old, 78 years after his debut. The funeral was in St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Hollywood. The service was described as brief and simple. Many actors were there, both old and young, including Dorothy Davenport, his daughter. A newspaper reported, Mr. Davenport was known and loved by a host of friends in Canton, where for many years he greeted everyone with a friendly smile and hand clasp. Davenport was a shy, gentle, private, self-effacing man, never given to effusiveness nor excessive pride. Harry's interests were always and only the stage. He had tremendous confidence in his professional ability to take on Hollywood at an age when most people wouldn't think of going downtown alone. Harry didn't change with the greatest success any more than he changed when the going was tough. He promised to come back and planned a couple of times to do so, but screen commitments always interfered. To close, I'll read a quote from Betty Davis, who said, "As a human being and as an actor, Harry Davenport will never be forgotten by any of us who worked with him. Without a doubt, he was one of the great character actors of all time. Anyone was lucky when he was in the cast. He wasn't acting in many of the roles that brought him fame, parts of kindly, philosophic old men. He was simply being Harry Davenport." Thank you.